The basics of the camera. By the end of this lesson, you should have a better understanding of the basic three things that make up a camera. Everything else in photography is just an enhancement to one of these three basic things, and we will explore these enhancements over the next several lessons. To get a better understanding of these three basic things, we will first take a look at different things. We will take a look at the eye, the pinhole camera, the camera obscura, the film camera, and the digital camera. The most basic parts of all cameras are light, lens, and recording media. That's it. Light. While light really has nothing to do with the camera, it must be present in some form for a camera to work. The very name of the technique is photography, and that means light writing. Next, the light has to pass through a lens, and lenses come in many different forms. Lenses can be extremely simple, and they can be rather complex, and we will explore this later. Then, the light strikes a recording media, and the recording media comes in many different forms too. The complexity of this is beyond the scope of this lesson too, and it will be explored in future lessons. We'll take a look at the basic forms of cameras in several different forms. First, there's the eye. Light passes through the lens and strikes the recording media, known as the retina. The light tickles the retina, turns itself into electrical signals that are then passed to the back of the brain or the occipital lobe and turned into something that you can see. You do not see with your eyes. You see with your brain, and you do not understand what you see what you understand. But that, too, is beyond the scope of this lesson.
The lens directly below it, and the retina, which lines the back of the eye. The retina consists of thin layers of light-sensitive tissue. This candle can help us understand how the eye captures images and then sends them to the brain. First, the candlelight passes through the cornea. As it does, it's bent or refracted onto the lens. As the light passes through the lens, it's bent a second time. Finally, it arrives at the retina, where an image is formed. This double bending, though, has reversed the image and turned it upside down. If that was the end of the story, the world would always appear upside down. Fortunately, the image is turned right side up in the brain. Before that can happen, the image needs to travel as impulses along the optic nerve and enter the brain's occipital lobe. When the image forms there, it regains its proper perspective.
Similar to the eye is something called the pinhole camera. Let's take a peek at what others have had to say about the pinhole camera.
Hey, my name is Eben Ostby. I've been working at Pixar since we were just half a dozen people working on experimental short films. One thing that hasn't changed since then is the need for virtual cameras. And to understand virtual cameras, you need a firm grasp of how physical cameras work. And I love cameras. In fact, I collect and fix and sometimes even build them. I built this in a CAD system and printed it out with 3D printing, and it takes pictures like that. And cameras come in all shapes and sizes, like this little baby twin lens, and this classic American Argus. So at Pixar, when we design a virtual camera, our job is to model what happens inside physical cameras. Have you ever thought about what a camera really does when we take a picture? You probably know that a camera captures light on a piece of film or image sensor. But to understand how this works, let's build a very simple camera. We'll start with a box. This is our camera body, and a single piece of paper, which represents our image sensor or film. We'll call this the image plane. You know what? Let's do this at a larger scale, like using an office as our box. Our scene is now outside the window, and our image plane is the opposite wall. We don't see a clear image. The problem is any point on our image plane is getting hit by light from everywhere in the scene. What we want is for each point on our image plane to be hit by light from a tiny region of the scene. Look at what happens if we cover up the window except for a little hole. We call this small hole the aperture of our camera. If you wait a few minutes for your eyes to adjust, voila, an image. The reason it works is because the aperture only lets certain light rays through. At this point, here, on the image plane, only light rays from one direction can make it through the aperture. And those light rays come from light bouncing off this place in the scene. So the aperture is filtering out any light rays that don't come from the right direction. This simple camera design is known as a pinhole camera. If we replaced the back wall of the room with a great big sheet of photographic film, we could take a great picture that way. Did you know that the word camera comes from the Latin word for room? The first cameras were known as camera obscura, meaning darkened room. They were, in fact, room size, like our office.
The knowledge of the pinhole camera once saved a fellow's life. It was back during the Desert Storm War. He was captured by enemy troops, and then he was shoved into a makeshift jail. In fact, it was just a room with a single door, and it was not really a jail cell at all. He was told that a man with a gun was on the other side of the street and would shoot him if he came out of the door. Using a rock, he made a small pinhole in the door, and then this projected onto the far wall everything that was going on outside. It was like a giant movie screen, but it was upside down. He could see no man with a gun, and shortly thereafter he saw some U.S. tanks coming down the street. He opened the door and ran to the tanks and was saved. He was saved because of his knowledge of the pinhole camera. Then there is something called the camera obscura.
Cameras. Use them every day, be it to check your teeth for food, take an artsy photo, or share a snapshot of what you're doing with all of your friends. As a whole, mankind has taken around 3.8 trillion photos ever, 10% of which were taken in the past 12 months. But have you ever considered how the camera came about in the first place? It begins with the human desire to capture reality. Drawing and painting were initially developed as a way to imitate and represent certain aspects of our surroundings. To assist in capturing this reality, they began with this, the camera obscura. The idea of the camera obscura is seen as early as the 4th century BC through the writings of an old Chinese philosopher, Mozi. Over the next millennia, it had been used by many a person, from Roger Bacon to Leonardo da Vinci. This camera does not capture images per se, but rather manipulates them. The light that is reflected off an external structure, for example, a building, comes into a room or box with a small hole in the side. The light, due to optical inversion, is then reflected upside down inside the box, in complete detail and color. Here is a real-life example of a camera obscura. As you can see, a hole has been cut into the wall, and the images from the outside have been reflected onto the inside. The camera obscura was among the first discoveries made in optics. Eventually, it led to various innovations, such as eyeglasses and laser beams. So how did we get something like this from the camera obscura? Let's go back to the Burgundy section of France, the year 1826. Joseph Niepce, a French inventor, had been experimenting with light-sensitive materials for quite some time. He was incapable as an artist, so he used his knowledge of chemistry to develop a bitumen solution, which he coated on a pewter plate and exposed to 8 hours of sunlight, capturing the first photograph known to mankind. After his death in 1833, Niepce's understudy, Louis Daguerre, took this idea and geared it towards public use in the form of a daguerreotype. This invention became vastly popular, but, as with any piece of technology, it had its issues. For one, during capture, each person would have to sit completely still for many minutes, hence why people in these photographs tend to look unhappy. It was difficult to hold a grin for the duration of the exposure, so many opted for a neutral face that sometimes came off as angry. With daguerreotypes, retaking an image really wasn't an option, so, in the year 1900, Kodak released this, the Kodak Brownie. The Brownie was the introduction to everyday photography as we know it today. As you can see, this is basically a miniature version of the camera obscura, with a hole cut out here that has a lens put in it, rather than a pinhole. This allows a more concentrated amount of light to flow into the camera, thus allowing a shorter exposure time. Through the viewfinder on the side, you are able to see what you are taking an image of, though it is upside down, as it was with the camera obscura. In order to capture the image, light-sensitive film would be placed here. The consumers of this product would never develop the images themselves, hence the tagline, "You press the button, we do the rest." Over the years, cameras have drastically transformed, from box to film, Polaroid, DSLR, GoPro, and even smartphones. So next time that you take a picture, consider how much history went into capturing that one moment.
The film camera. It, too, has the same basic parts of the eye, pinhole camera, and camera obscura. First, there has to be enough light, enough detectable light, and then there is a lens, and then there is recording media. In the case of the film camera, the light is focused on something that is light sensitive. These are chemicals that are on a piece of glass or plastic. The glass plates or plastic strips must then be treated with more chemicals to produce what is called a negative. The recording media, that is called film, allows light to pass through it. But everything is different. That is, what should be white is black, and what should be black is white. The grays, they're somewhere in between of the whites and the blacks. So in the film camera, the basic things exist. There is light, a lens, and recording media. And finally, there is the digital camera. It has everything that the film camera has except that the recording media is an electronic chip called a CCD. The CCD turns the light into electrical signals, almost exactly like the retina of the eye, and then the electrical signals are then saved. By now, you should have a basic understanding of the three main parts of a camera, and you should be able to answer or respond to the following. In a well-written format, respond to all of the questions and statements below. Name all three parts of the camera and briefly explain what each one does. Briefly explain how an eye works. Briefly explain how a pinhole camera works. Briefly explain something interesting about the camera obscura. Briefly explain how a film camera is different than a digital camera.